Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be discussing the case of a mother of two who went missing under very suspicious circumstances. Sadly, for years, most of the information surrounding her disappearance never made headlines until a bombshell was revealed 5 years after she vanished. But the details of what came out are probably not what you'd expect. Today's case is about the disappearance of Sandy Baker. 46-year-old Sandra K. Baker, better known as Sandy, was living in Florida back in 1999. But at some point that year, she met a 47-year-old man named William Cree Jr., a.k.a. Billy, who was a successful electrician. The trouble was that the two lived over 1,000 miles away from each other, with Sandy still residing in Florida and Billy living in Pennsylvania. From what I can tell, Sandy's best friend, Linda Henry, lived in Greenville, Pennsylvania at the time and was an acquaintance of Billy's, and she is who introduced the two. Despite the distance between the new couple, they very quickly hit it off and developed an intense relationship. Just a short time after Sandy and Billy began dating, Sandy made the decision to move from Florida, where she owned a home, up to Fredonia in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. The couple lived together at Billy's parents' home, which was located at 62 Folk Road in Fredonia. At the time, Sandy did already have 2 children from previous marriages, Sean and Shadara, but they continued to live in Florida as I believe they were adults at the time, so it wasn't like Sandy was moving her children up to Pennsylvania along with her. Now, I learned my lesson with our last case, so John, I'm going to send you a Google Map aerial view of where the couple's residence was located.
Fantastic.
Any little thing I will be showing you as soon as I bring it up.
Cool. What do we got?
So, if you look in the folder that I sent you, it should say 62 Folk Road Google aerial view.
Yep, I see it. We are in a densely wooded area outside of some fields.
Pretty much, yeah. There's a lot of tree coverage right around the house, and I think this property was like on 7 acres. So Billy's parents owned this property. He lived in it with Sandy, but it was, they must have owned at least the majority of like this tree coverage here, depending on where like the acreage sat. So
is this a current photo or an old photo?
This is more recent, within like 2010 to 2020,
okay,
like when they did all the aerial stuff on Google Maps. Now, Sandy and Billy were not together for very long when they decided to take their relationship to the next level and became engaged and started to plan their future together, which, from the outside looking in, could be a shock to some, while others might not think anything of getting married that early on in a relationship.
How early on?
It seemed like within months that they were getting engaged, starting to plan this life. She met him in 99 and they were planning a wedding for 2000. So it was like very
That's
quick.
pretty quick. I assume this would be their second marriage for both of them?
Multiple marriages between the two of them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. But either way, in terms of how quickly the couple began dating, obviously moved in together and then got engaged, Linda, Sandy's best friend, the one who introduced her and Billy, stated that Sandy, quote, tended to fall hard if she liked a man, end quote. And it appears as though that's exactly what happened when it came to Billy. So once the couple became engaged, they very soon after began planning their wedding, which was set for October 7th of 2000. The ceremony was shaping up to be intimate and beautiful and was going to be held at one of Sandy's favorite places, the Kids Mill Covered Bridge, which was located in Mercer County, the same area where she was now living with Billy. And just an interesting fact about the bridge, it was actually the only one left in Mercer County. And according to a write-up on the Visit Mercer County, Pennsylvania website, quote, the bridge is situated in a rural area and spans the Shenango River. The structure was constructed in 1868 by the Smith Bridge Company of Tip City, Ohio. Devised and patented in 1867 by Robert Smith, both tension and compression members were all wood. The Kids Mill Bridge is the only one of Smith's patented bridges still standing east of Ohio, end quote.
I don't know why, but when you first said, that this was going to take place at one of our favorite places,
Mm-hmm.
and then kids came out of your mouth, I was like, is this going to be like a Chuck E. Cheese or something?
Oh my God.
You're like, kids
No.
mill. And then I was like, oh, okay, it's a bridge. It's a place.
Yeah. Which I actually have a photo of it if you wanted to take a look.
That would be great. I love
Yes,
photos.
yes. So it's within this
see it.
folder again, Kids Mill Covered Bridge.
Oh, okay, this is like your typical covered bridge, wooden, whatever.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it looks picturesque. You know, you have the river flowing behind it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure, you know, in October, it was probably going to be beautiful with the leaves changing.
Mm-hmm.
So it looked like a good backdrop for a wedding.
Yeah, what was the name of the river again?
The Shenango River.
I gotta say, Pennsylvania always keeps it coming with the weird names of stuff.
They absolutely do. And I was struggling a little bit with some of the counties. You know how they always do like the town and then Mercer County. You've got Fredonia and you have Mercer County.
Fredonia.
Yeah.
Sounds like a video game place.
Yeah, it's such a bizarre name. And then you also have, I think it's pronounced Pymatuning Township.
God bless you.
Yeah. So that's like the overarching, you know, county, I guess, of like where she goes missing from.
Okay.
So, but
I mean, from the overhead picture, from you showing like this bridge where it's seems a little bit more rural, it seems as though this whole area of Pennsylvania where she liked to frequent and where they lived was a more rural portion of the state.
that's what it seemed like. Yeah.
It seemed like a farm town almost based on the newer aerial photos. I don't know if that's how it was back then, but
I mean,
still a lot of trees. From the overhead from more recently, there's clearly fields.
yeah. It's not like this is 1970, you know, we're in
Right.
2000 here. So I would kind of tend to think that it probably hasn't changed that much, but who knows? Now, between 8:30 and 9 a.m. on May 25th, 2000, about 4.5 months prior to the couple's planned nuptials, Sandy had been seen at a Sheetz convenience store located on Route 18 in Transfer, Pennsylvania, with the exact address of the location being 270 Edgewood Drive Extension, Transfer, Pennsylvania. It's unclear exactly why Sandy was there, whether she stopped in to pick something up, fill up her gas tank, or what, but Billy was there with her. It's unclear what the two discussed, but this day is important because it was the last day that anyone would see Sandy Baker. So Billy was there with her. They must have spoken about something, done something, whatever. And then after that, Sandy left the parking lot in her dark blue 1988 four-door Honda Accord, which actually still had her Florida license plates on it, as well as a vanity plate affixed to the front bearing her nickname Sandy. Now, as of today, this convenience store does still appear to be in existence. And John, yet again, I'm going to send you a link to the Google Maps I have so you can kind of see like what the area looks like. And then I also have a picture of what a 1988 dark blue four-door Honda Accord looks like so that you can take a look as well. This one is not Sandy's car in particular, but it was the closest, you know, that I could find looking that up.
Okay. I know I had just said that it seems kind of rural, but this seems, not that this would be the center, but it seems like more like a town center. It's got a market, it's got a bowling alley, this, that, and the other thing, at least nowadays.
Yeah, but if you zoom out, you can see that there's still a fair amount of tree coverage. You go to the east and you've got, you know, still more of those fields, more trees. I think overall you're right. Like it seems like a much more rural area in Pennsylvania.
So, Sheetz Convenience Store. Is that still the same name?
Yes, that's what it was in 2000. That's what it is today. And what I find to be particularly odd, as I am looking at this map right now, and I did not catch this until this moment, the police department is right behind it.
Am I blind? Where is Sheetz?
It should have the big red arrow, 270 Edgewood Drive Extension, Transfer,
Oh, okay.
Pennsylvania.
I was looking for the name.
Oh, yeah, no.
All right. Yeah, huh? The Pymatuning Township Police Department, literally right next to it.
Yeah, that's odd.
It is odd.
I did not even realize that.
You had said that Billy and Sandy had some type of conversation in the lot of this store.
I think anyway.
Yeah, it'd be a weird place to have some type of domestic argument with the
Yeah.
police department right next to it. So you had said that Sandy left in her own vehicle. Was Billy there in his own vehicle, or
I'm not
on
100% sure on that, but I think he must have been. I don't know if it was like they met up there. I mean, me and you have done things like that where it's like you're at work and I'm leaving and it's like, oh, we need to go do something. Let's just go in our own cars.
Yeah.
So maybe that's all it was. I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that when she left that parking lot, she left alone. Now, after Sandy left the convenience store parking lot, Billy stated he did end up hearing from his fiancée again. Supposedly, him seeing her at the Sheetz store wasn't the last time that he ended up speaking to her, at least according to his version of events. So, Billy stated that around 1 p.m. that same day, May 25th, Sandy called him and provided him with some very concerning information. She allegedly told Billy that she was in trouble or in some sort of danger and she wouldn't be coming home. But she did apparently let him know that she'd at least give him a call in the next few days. After that supposed phone call, though, no one else would ever see or hear from Sandy Baker again.
Well, let me just say I don't believe Billy.
Did you catch my drift by the way I wrote this?
No, I'm just saying.
Okay.
Oh, the last time I heard from my wife, she said she was in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And that she would call me later, and she never did.
Yeah.
That is so unbelievable.
It is unbelievable. So
if you had called me, obviously we've been together much longer than they were together for, and we know that Sandy supposedly falls quickly for men that she's interested in. But if you called me and you were like, I'm in trouble, I'd be like, okay, find me.
Where are you? What do
where
we
you
do?
going? I'm coming to pick you up.
Yes,
Not,
exactly.
You know, I'm in trouble. I'll call you later, and then never hear from her again.
Right? So you're going to
Come on, Billy.
Yeah. And it's so bizarre, like, why I keep thinking this, but the entire time, and it's probably because I can't find a picture anywhere online of what Billy
Loomis
looks like. Yeah, that's all that's in my head.
Yeah.
It's literally Skeet Ulrich. Like, is the only person that I can, like, associate with the name Billy, and it's throwing me.
I think of Billy Loomis from Scream, and I also think of Billy, the blue Power Ranger from the original Power Rangers.
Okay, that's not in my head. I don't even know what he looks like.
He's a white guy with glasses.
Okay.
That's really good at karate.
Oh, man. Now, one might expect that after receiving an alarming phone call like this, that Billy would have gone, I don't know, maybe straight to authorities and reported his fiancée missing because that's concerning. But that does not appear to be the case here. From what I can tell, it appears as though Billy did not report Sandy missing until 5 days after he'd last seen her at the convenience store in Transfer, Pennsylvania. So that would have now been May 31st, 2000, when an official missing persons report was filed for her.
That'll be 6 days later.
That is how you do math. Thank you. Should I redo that or?
I don't know. You tell me.
That's fine. We can leave it. It's genuine.
Okay.
Brittany sucks at math. John does my math for me. So I did want to make mention of some discrepancies on this fact. Not the fact that, like, I can't do math, but the fact that, you know, he didn't report her missing for several days. Mm-hmm. But there were reports that stated that Billy never reported Sandy missing, while there were others that made it seem like maybe he did so within a day or two. But based on later reporting, overall, it does appear to me that he did alert authorities of his fiance's disappearance, but the details surrounding exactly how and when all of that went down just aren't clear.
Well, for all we know, it could have been Papa Crier.
Yes.
He was also a Billy.
This is true.
And I mean...
But I don't know where he was or if he was around, so I don't know anything about
They lived with
dad.
the parents.
No, in their house. Like, I don't know if they lived with them.
Oh,
I think
I'm
if this
thinking
was a
they
house
lived
they
with them.
owned. No.
Are we sure about that?
I'm not sure about that, no.
Okay, so
There's
maybe,
a lot of things I'm not sure about, so maybe you're right.
Yeah, maybe because if they did live together in the house,
Yeah.
maybe it was like sectioned off and it was almost like
An in-law.
an in-law apartment or something like that. That would be fine.
Yeah, that's possible.
But you would think that once your fiance doesn't come home for an extended period of time, your parents would be like, if you did live with them, they'd be like, where's Sandy?
Mm-hmm.
Be like, oh, she told me she's in trouble, but she's going to call me. Like, really?
It's so bad.
Okay, so we're 5 days later. We don't know if Billy really reported her missing, but it seems as though somebody alerted authorities because I'm sure they get involved here.
Correct, yes. And I did just want to say, like, not that I think a devil's advocate situation is, like, necessarily needed here, but you could say, to play devil's advocate in this situation, did Billy wait to report her missing until he did not receive the phone call that she promised him? You know what I mean?
Well, she said a couple days.
Correct.
A couple
6
is 2.
days. Okay, fine. But that's the thing. Maybe the reports where it was like 2 days later or something like that are accurate. Who knows? But
yeah,
either
right.
way, there can always be a reason why. But.
Right. But I mean, at least we know that authorities are not going to get involved.
Correct.
So where do we go from here?
So authorities now had a description of what Sandy looked like and what she was last seen wearing. She was described as a 46-year-old white female who stood 5 feet 4 inches tall with short, almost pixie-cut strawberry blonde hair and double-pierced ears. And in terms of what she was last seen wearing, that was described as, quote, a white tank top underneath a blue denim shirt, Levi's jeans, brown boots, a white gold engagement ring, and 4 earrings with small, round, pink stones embedded in the upper portions, end quote. Now, John, I'm going to send you a couple of photos of Sandy so you can take a look. You can have a good visual of her in your head as we continue on. So
Okay.
You can open up any one of these pictures of her.
I love a good Canadian tuxedo.
Yes, I do too. Denim on denim.
Mm-hmm.
I will rock it forever. Now, the frustrating thing at this point in May of 2000 is that there weren't any news reports about Sandy's disappearance. I scoured newspaper archives, and I personally was unable to find a single piece from May, or even June for that matter, from when Sandy first went missing. The very first article I was able to find in any paper about Sandy was from October of 2000, the same month she was supposed to be getting married. And now it had been over 4 months after she'd been last seen. What was reported in this one piece I was able to locate was that Linda Henry, Sandy's best friend, was hosting a picnic lunch to remember her friend and attempt to bring awareness and attention to her case. But interestingly, at this point, just 4.5 months into the investigation, with literally nothing reported in the media about where things stood in the case prior to this time frame, authorities were now stating that they felt as though Sandy had met with foul play and even mentioned that they had a suspect in the case.
Interesting.
But they were not releasing any information on where the investigation really stood or disclosing their suspect's identity. And after that little blip in the media, based on what I'm able to find online, there was practically nothing reported on in her case for years.
Well, I mean, it's odd that there's also a 4-month gap between when she was last seen and the first article that's published in the area.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that authorities weren't doing anything for that time period, but, I mean, when you're looking at a rural place in Pennsylvania and it's got one of these weird names, I'm assuming that it's probably a small town, not a huge population. When one resident goes missing, I mean, you'd think that that would be, like, cause for concern.
I agree. And I wonder, it's hard to... You can't find everything on the internet. So for all I know, there could have been, like, something on the local news at night, just on TV that ran at, like, 5 o'clock or something.
Right, like a local woman goes missing type thing, just as a quick blurb.
Yeah.
Saying, if you have any information on her, or I've seen this woman, please contact the police. Right.
Exactly.
And that very well could have happened, and there's just not an article on it. But you would hope that it would be picked up by newspapers and stuff, too.
Yeah, and that's what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't locate anything. And I was looking, Sandra Baker, Sandra K. Baker, Sandy Baker, nothing.
And I'm just thinking, in the early 2000s, did they still put people on milk cartons?
They did, and it's funny you say that, because that was actually something that Linda Henry, pushed for. She got, this local dairy company to put Sandy's picture on milk cartons. So it was still something that was happening in 2000, where, when I think of putting someone's face on a milk carton that's missing, I think of, the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's so hard. Time goes by so fast. It's hard to even remember back to these times that, I was still, a teenager or just becoming a teenager around those times. But it's I can't even remember if that was a thing back then.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about even longer.
I feel like we go back down memory lane a lot, though, covering these older cases and, not just focusing on cases that are in the news right now. We're going back and we're learning, what these investigations were like back then. And I feel like it, not only is it us reminiscing on things, but I feel like you learn more and more about the way police have evolved over the years. Yeah. And the new things that they do to try and solve these cases versus what they did in 2000.
Yeah, and also thinking back to the early 2000s and asking that question to you, it's also going to stick out in my mind now. So the next time that we have a missing persons case in the early 2000s, I'll be wondering, hey, did they put him on a milk carton?
Yeah, definitely. So despite the lack of news coverage, that didn't mean that there wasn't anything going on in Sandy's case. So let's back up to the end of May of 2000 when Sandy first disappeared and the first few months following that, and we'll kind of review what I've been able to uncover about what took place, what authorities found, what they didn't, etc. So for starters, authorities did not appear to be particularly concerned in the early days after Sandy disappeared. They felt as though it was possible that she could have just run off, and they kind of came up with the idea that maybe she got cold feet about her upcoming wedding and just left. And due to that initial belief, authorities didn't distribute missing persons flyers, they didn't put out a bolo for Sandy or her car, and as we already know, there wasn't really much reporting, so, were they pushing for the media to put her case out there?
I would guess no.
Yeah, probably not. However, as time went on and authorities continued to uncover more information about the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, their thought process changed pretty quickly. And I think that's when the idea that Sandy may have met with foul play began to form, because we know by that 4-month mark, they were already saying, we think she met with foul play, we've got a suspect.
Yeah, I mean, even us looking at this, obviously when you bring a case to me, I know that there is a good chance that foul play may be a portion of it.
Yep.
But just hearing Billy's excuse about why Sandy is now missing already put me in the mindset of, okay, what's going on here? Because that seems like just such a strange thing for somebody to say.
Yep.
So already I'd be kind of like, really? What's going on? Did she get cold feet? I mean, maybe. But
like
you would want to look into it more.
Yeah, like just talking to Billy, you'd be like, your statement's a little sketch versus, Judy Brown, who we just talked about a couple weeks ago, where her husband was visibly shaken. He was upset. He was, calling police. He called police probably at least multiple times if he called them, during the night and then again in the morning to officially report her missing. He's concerned. He's doing this immediately.
Right.
There's a difference between a spouse,
waiting 6 days.
Yes, versus a spouse that's very concerned calling police essentially within hours of not seeing their wife.
Right. When you find out that a soon-to-be spouse is quote-unquote in trouble, I'll call you in a few days. Right there, I'm like, worst case scenario, I should probably call the police, because if they're in trouble and maybe somebody's after them, somebody might get to them before they can get to where they need to go, and they want to contact me. That's just me, and that's, our cautious and pessimistic nature.
Yes, it's very true, but I think it's, and I'm sorry for anyone who's not like this, but I think it's better to be that way.
Yeah.
Because we say this all the time. What's the worst case scenario?
Right. And
You're
I think,
embarrassed.
Yes, that goes from like a personal level with us, but also to like police and investigators now too. It's a lot easier to put out a bolo nowadays where you go into the computer system, fill out the information, boom, send it out to everybody.
Yeah.
More so than it probably was in the 2000s. Everything was a little bit more, low tech back then. So it probably took more legwork to get it done. So before doing it, they wanted to make sure that it was worthwhile doing.
It makes sense. Yeah, it does. Sucks, but I get it.
Yeah.
But okay, so still sticking with this end of May, early June timeframe, let's first discuss the last sighting of Sandy. So we know that Billy had mentioned that he'd seen her at the Sheetz convenience store, and that was later confirmed to be a factual comment made by Billy, as authorities were able to definitively confirm that Sandy had been there after they reviewed the store's surveillance footage.
Were they able to confirm that Billy was also there?
So that was actually literally my next sentence. I don't know for sure, because that's never been put out publicly, but I have to assume he was, because he's the one that's saying, like, I saw her there, I watched her leave the parking lot, and then police verify that she was there.
But we never know what was said between the two of them?
No, I don't know any of that. Any of what transpired outside of her being there and then her leaving there.
Okay, well, what if he was following her and knew that she was there but didn't really have that conversation with her?
It doesn't appear as though she was followed. So
chances are he was probably there. And that part is true. And the fact that she was at Sheetz is true.
Correct.
So where she goes after that is really what we need to track down.
Exactly. So authorities were able to ascertain that Sandy left the parking lot of that store in her own car by herself around the same time frame that Billy said that they were there. So between like 8:30 and 9 a.m. And as much as it can be frustrating in the early days of an investigation when authorities don't necessarily take things seriously, I believe the fact that they were able to, put eyes on Sandy in this video. They saw her leave the lot by herself. She's in her own car. No one else is in there with her. There's nobody following her. She looks normal. She's not distressed. I would have to think that that's likely a part of the reason why authorities weren't overly concerned. And you probably have to assume Billy doesn't seem overly concerned either. So
yes, but the more I think about it and the more I think about the location of where Sheetz is located and how the police department is literally right next to it, if Sandy knew that she was in trouble, maybe not necessarily when she had the conversation at Sheetz with Billy, but if she had some general idea about herself being in trouble, if that was true, she's right next to the police station.
It is true, yeah.
Unless a police officer was the one that she was in trouble with.
I wouldn't think so, yeah.
I'm not saying that, but you would think that, hey, if I'm in trouble and I'm right next to the police station, I'm going to say, hey, this person's after me.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I mean...
And then you have a firsthand account as opposed to Billy, maybe reporting her missing. 6 days later, you have this girl coming to you saying, hey, I have a problem, somebody's after me. And then when she goes missing, then police already know that this woman just said, somebody's after me, and now she's gone.
Well, here's the other thing, too, is I don't know if that's the police department that Billy reported her missing to. I think it was actually Mercer County. So you have, the Pymatuning PD that's over there, but then you have, like we talked about this, with New Jersey recently, your overarching, county or sheriff's office, I think is what Mercer County was. Okay. So I don't know if it's one of those situations where, like, she didn't actually get reported missing to the police station that is just very weirdly right next door that I just now noticed, but...
Even today, that's a thing that gets muddled and everybody's always trying to pass the buck, because if you went missing, I would go to our local police department and I would report you missing. Because
from the town or city that you live in.
This is where you reside. I would go to our local police department.
Yep.
But if I knew that you were in, South County at the time you went missing, most people would think, go to South County and report you missing.
Yeah.
South County's going to say, you need to go to your local police department and report her missing.
And I've seen this in research so many times before where people are sent all over the place.
Right, and then you have to count on somebody to actually be like, fine, I'll take the report.
Yes. And it's like, can we get them reported missing somewhere so that somebody is out looking for this person?
Right.
When you're ping-ponging a family member between multiple police departments, what are they supposed to do?
Right. You got to put yourself in their shoes and, like, say I went to the local police department and the local police department was like, you know that she was in South County, you got to go to South County and you got to report her missing. And then I go to South County and they're like, hey, you're from such and such a place. You need to go to your local police department and report her missing. By then, I'm already miffed. I went one place that I thought I was supposed to go.
Yep.
They sent me all the way to you.
Yep.
Now you're sending me all the way back to them.
I'd be like, where's the state police? Because I'm all set.
Right. I mean, that would be the next logical step. But also, some people may be like, all right, I'm going to go back to my local police department. And then you get stuck in this ping pong where it's like, nobody wants to do it. It takes one person to just say, fine, I'm going to take the report, even though I may not be the right one to do it. Take it, enter it into the system, put the information out. Now it's known statewide.
Yes, exactly. And I just think, the average person probably doesn't even realize what you're supposed to do in that instance. And so you're the average person, and now you're dealing with a missing loved one. You're probably incredibly scatterbrained, and you're freaking out, and you're upset, and you don't know what to do. So it makes it even worse in that moment.
Absolutely. And you feel like nobody cares because they're like, oh, go to this other place. Oh, go to this other place. So like what you were saying, best case scenario, go to the state police because they have jurisdiction over everything.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be like, oh, go to your local PD. Well, hopefully they're not going to do that.
Yeah, I would hope not. But
right.
Who
Where
knows?
Where it ends up getting muddied is like, say you were on vacation in Florida.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, well, now she's missing. Then you would probably just go to wherever you were last seen.
Exactly.
But state police, like you were saying, overarching, they can cover everything. So
yep.
If you're unfortunately ever stuck in that situation, any of our listeners, local where you live, don't take no for an answer.
Yep.
If everybody's giving you a line of BS, just go to state police and hopefully they'll take care of you.
Yeah. Imagine if like someone was like, well, Wicked Deeds podcast told me
that I need to report them missing from my local police department. So get your pen and take my info.
Write it down. That'd be so funny.
Yep.
All right. So outside of that convenience store sighting on May 25th and the alleged phone call that Billy said Sandy made to him, which, spoiler alert, I will say, I have not seen verified anywhere. So if police looked into Sandy's phone records, I don't know what they found or if they found any calls from Sandy to Billy, but just wanted to make mention of that.
Do we know if Sandy had a cell phone? It's like right on the cusp.
Not sure.
No?
I'm not sure, unfortunately.
I mean, there were still payphones in 2000. That's one thing I remember.
This is true.
But, okay. I mean, the fact that you haven't been able to find anything that states that factually truly happened.
Mm-hmm.
I was skeptic to begin with already, but...
Add another notch to that ladder of skepticism.
It just makes it that much stronger.
Yep. But outside of this convenience store sighting and the, alleged phone call that Billy's saying Sandy made to him, there was actually an additional sighting of Sandy on the same day she was last seen at the convenience store. So this additional witness mentioned that they saw her driving in her 1988 Honda Accord south towards Sharon, Pennsylvania, which for me, now knowing this, kind of begged the question, did authorities notice whether or not Sandy was headed south out of the convenience store parking lot that day? Are they piecing all these things together? And this is kind of yet another reason why they weren't as concerned, because everything is matching up. Was she driving south? And they're like, oh, somebody else saw her. So she must have just gotten these cold feet and, left.
So where this person saw her driving south, was it on Route 18, which is what Sheetz is on?
I believe so. I mean, there's really only 2 ways out of there. And
outside of going into a neighborhood.
Are you saying was the sighting on Route 18?
Yes.
I don't know. All I know is that wherever they saw her, she was headed south towards Sharon, Pennsylvania.
Okay, so just so our listeners know that may not have access to see these maps at the time, if you leave Sheetz convenience store, you can very easily get onto Route 18, which seems to be a major, not highway, but a thoroughfare that runs through Pennsylvania and would take you south towards Clark and Sharpeville. And I mean, how far south do you have to get to Sharon?
Sharon is like southwest almost of Sharpsville. Okay,
so you would assume that if somebody mentioned that she was driving south towards Sharon,
yep,
she must have been generally close
to that
Sharon.
Area. That's what I would think, but again, it's one of those things that you just don't really know.
Okay. And then something else that had popped into my head before, but I forgot to ask you. Obviously, police were talking to Billy, but we know that Linda Henry was the person that connected those two, so you would assume that Linda and Sandy had a relatively good or long-standing relationship between the two.
Yes.
So what information, if any, was Linda Henry able to provide as far as Sandy's whereabouts go?
I really don't know what Linda was able to provide. And I have this feeling that she's probably given authorities everything she can, but she wants to protect the integrity of her friend's investigation and hasn't spoken about that publicly. Yeah. A lot of what she's spoken about is about Sandy. It's about keeping her case out there. It's to continue talking about her. And I think just anything that she might have told the police, she's kept to herself, which I think is good. I think that's, kind of what you need rather than people just out here telling everything that could essentially be critical to this investigation.
Yeah, or would just be a falsehood that they're perpetuating.
It could be either or. So
they're like, oh, I think this happened, so then they say it, and then everybody just grabs a hold of it and it snowballs, and that's like the new theory just because of some random thing said on a whim.
Yeah, and she definitely does not seem like the type that would do that. She's taken this very seriously over the years.
Yeah, and you said that she had the memorial to try and keep the case out there to look for Sandy and everything,
So after that, there were no additional sightings of Sandy, no sightings of her vehicle, and no other phone calls made from her. Now, at this point, I'm sure, obviously you can tell John and I are, but I'm sure you're all probably curious about Billy, as we both clearly are. I definitely was when I first began my research on this case. And from what I can tell, he had originally been fully cooperative with the investigation. He spoke with police, but I just don't know how many interviews he had with them, whether it was just one or multiple, and I don't know how any of those went. But at some point, Billy ended up securing a lawyer. And after that, he stopped cooperating with the investigation and was no longer speaking with police about the disappearance of his fiancée.
Well, I think even for an innocent person, not saying that Billy's guilty, but even for an innocent person, you can't not feel as though the more you're interrogated, the more police want to talk to you, that you're being targeted and you may get pinned for something that you are not guilty of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it were me, I'd be like, okay, you've talked to me 16 times now and I'm a little nervous. Why are you doing this?
Well, you wouldn't even talk to police because the first time that they came and knocked on the door, wondering about where I was, you'd say, I need a lawyer.
Oh,
it's the safer thing to do.
That's my first response to everything. Everybody listening, if you are ever caught in any sort of situation, I would say that you should probably have counsel with you. Not an expert, but it's what I would do.
You don't want stuff to be misconstrued, and you don't want people to be able to coerce you unknowingly. It all comes down to self-preservation. You want to be able to help, but you also don't want to get,
pinched,
stuck in the jackpot.
Agreed. Okay, so I will say there was a lot going on between this June 2000 timeframe and July of 2005. But in order for you to understand everything that happened and kind of why it all happened, I have to fast forward to that July 2005 timeframe and drop a bombshell on you. And after I throw that at you, we'll need to back up again, and I'll give you some background information, and we'll review more of what took place during those 5 years that led to where things ended up in 2005. And I am going to apologize in advance, but we are going to do a lot of jumping around in the timeline in this episode, but I really don't think there was a clearer way to tell this story without jumping back and forth, because it would honestly just jumble all of the details of this case. But to make it easier for everyone, including John, I've posted a timeline on our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, so you can kind of follow along with each piece to the puzzle, and I'm just hoping that it makes it a bit easier to follow.
And I'll do my best where, if I'm confused, I'll ask for both my own benefit and our listeners. And if I need to reiterate something to say, okay, this is what we know, and continue on, I'll do my best to do so.
Perfect. So in early July of 2005, two major things happened and became public knowledge. First, a 48-year-old man by the name of Clifford Ailey was charged with 4 third-degree felony counts of hindering the apprehension or prosecution of the person who killed Sandy Baker. And second, within the same affidavit released citing these charges against Clifford, authorities also named Billy Cree Jr. as a suspect in Sandy's disappearance and now presumed murder. An arrest warrant was issued for Clifford Ailey, but no charges had been filed against Billy at this point. Clifford had apparently told authorities he would turn himself in prior to the arrest warrant being issued, but he never showed up, so investigators classified him as a fugitive, and then they put out this arrest warrant. Within a few days, though, by July 5th of 2005, Ailey turned himself in, was booked into the Mercer County Jail, and then the following day, his bail was set at $50,000.
When you're contacted, made aware of the charges against you, and then you flee and essentially turn into a fugitive from justice, everybody's going to be out hunting for you.
Oh, yeah.
That's a bad
sure
move.
Of that.
And unless you're a master of disguise, you're probably going to get caught.
Yeah, I don't think this guy was a master of disguise.
Now, I'm interested to learn about the relationship between Clifford and Billy. And again, it's always important once somebody is labeled a suspect, that means that investigators probably have a pretty strong case against that person. Otherwise, they'd probably be labeled as a person of interest in the case.
Exactly. So that brings me back to October of 2000 in that first piece that I found on the case where they're 4.5 months in and they're like, yep, we have a suspect. But they weren't saying anything yet because they didn't have a strong enough case to say, this is who our suspect is. We're naming him.
Right.
And here's why. That didn't happen, probably because they didn't have a strong enough case to say so yet.
And then their route to get that case was probably through Clifford, and he was clearly obstructing their investigation if he was charged with hindering the apprehension of a suspect.
Exactly. So
now, what did Clifford owe Billy? How is there...
Well, okay, there's a lot here.
Okay.
There is a lot. So I'm sure all of our listeners are like, what? And they're thinking, this is a lot to digest. And you probably have 10,000 questions, John. I am sure our listeners do. And I'm hoping I'll be able to answer a fair few of them. But before we dive into what took place between, again, roughly June of 2000 to this point we're at now in July of 2005, like I said a minute ago, we need to go back. And I want to give you a little bit of information on first Clifford Ailey, who he was, what he did for work, and some of his past dealings with the law. And then I want to go over Billy's past and some information I was able to find about him. And then from there, we can review what happened in Sandy's case that involved Ailey and why he was now being charged with hindering this investigation. So, as authorities had been investigating Sandy's disappearance, they had obviously begun to feel as though she could have met with foul play. We talked about that earlier. Things just weren't adding up. She hadn't called anyone. She hadn't used her bank accounts or her credit cards.
Billy had a bullshit story.
Yep. And no one was able to locate her or her vehicle. It didn't make sense that she was, planning this new life, this new marriage, that she'd just run off, and she's also leaving her kids behind, if that's the case as well. It wasn't adding up. So, as investigators dug deeper, they turned their attention to Billy Cree Jr. and wanted to find out more about him and any friends or acquaintances he and Sandy might have shared. Well, in comes Clifford Ailey, who was a private investigator living in the Ambridge, Pennsylvania area, and he owned and operated his PI firm, Sloan Detective Agency, which was out of Newcastle, Pennsylvania. But Mr. Ailey wasn't just a PI. He was also one of Billy Cree Jr.'s best friends.
From childhood?
Not sure, unfortunately. I tried to figure that out, but I'm not positive. So Clifford owned and ran this PI agency, and he pretty much did background checks on spouses or soon-to-be spouses, as it was in Sandy and Billy's case. And I guess back in the 90s, there had been some complaints about his business and how he ran things. And according to the Assistant Chief County Detective for Beaver County, Andrew Gall, Clifford didn't necessarily do illegal things within his business back then, but more so things that were potentially unethical.
I was going to say, Clifford Unethical Ailey.
Perfect. That's the name. Now, with that being said, Clifford also had some previous run-ins with the law and had been charged at one point with harassment and simple assault sometime in the early 2000s, after a woman came forward to police stating that she'd been assaulted by Mr. Ailey, and I do believe that woman had been a prior girlfriend of his. Also, come June of 2004, there had been a lawsuit brought against Ailey to have his PI license revoked, and according to reporting done in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Lawrence County District Attorney, Matthew Mangino, quote, accused Ailey of employing a person at his detective agency who had a felony record, end quote.
Billy?
I don't think so. No, he was an electrician.
Jeez.
So,
well, doesn't mean that Billy the electrician can't have a felony record.
This is true. You're not wrong there. But based on this little bit of info, you've got, he's kind of got a little bit of a sordid past as a PI.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say originally before finding out that these charges against him, the simple assault and the harassment, had to do with an ex-girlfriend. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's pretty bad, but whatever. I could see, not the greatest PI being under the microscope and charged with harassment. Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about simple assault now, I mean, you're putting your hands on somebody, you're throwing something.
That's a domestic type situation. That's not a, someone you're bringing in and you're just getting a little rough with them that you're, someone you're questioning.
Right. I was saying, I think you still attached it to the girlfriend.
Oh, okay.
I was saying I could see a private investigator, somebody trying to get them charged with harassment because he's always around, he's trying to find information. But the second simple assault comes into play, you're now putting your hands on somebody, or you're throwing something at them.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
Trying to incite violence there or whatever.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, he has a sordid past, but he got his PI license. Yeah, he doesn't seem to be the best of guys.
No, not at all. And
so
you'll find out even more as we keep going about him. So, come to find out, Billy had actually hired Clifford to look into Sandy prior to her disappearance in May of 2000.
I figured as much.
Yeah. So for one reason or another, apparently Billy was feeling particularly suspicious of his bride-to-be, specifically in terms of potential infidelity, and he wanted Clifford to look into her background for him. Clifford did so and uncovered some details about Sandy and her past that supposedly made Billy very upset, at least based on what I've seen reported. What Mr. Ailey uncovered was 1, that Sandy had previously been married 6 times. 2, she was still technically married to a man in Florida when she and Billy became engaged. And 3, she was in significant debt and was behind on her car payments. From what I've gathered, this information was provided to Billy from Clifford Ailey roughly 2 weeks before Sandy disappeared.
Okay, hear me out. I was suspicious of Billy.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were in his shoes and I find this information out, and this lady has been lying to me all this time, and it hasn't been that long that we've been together, boom, wedding cut off, I'm sorry, I would like to see other people.
There is a better way to go about this, though, than what probably took place in this case. You sit this person down, you have a conversation with them, you say, listen, I was feeling a little off about things. I'm sorry that I dug into your past, but here's what I found. and it doesn't work for me. And that's fine. That might not have worked for him. Or
Right.
if it were roles reversed and she found out about some of his past, because, guys, he ain't all that clean either. I'll be telling you about him in a minute. So,
Okay, so with that being said, what I had written down here, I said, Billy's suspicion of infidelity with Sandy.
Mm-hmm.
Projection, question mark?
Yes, I see what you're saying.
Oftentimes, what we are guilty of, we project onto our partners.
Mm-hmm.
And if he's thinking that she's taking part in some type of extramarital affair or extra fiancéal affair,
Yes.
I don't think that's a word.
Fiancéal.
But if she's, like got a side piece or something,
Mm-hmm.
and, he's like, oh, what the hell's going on? And then contacts his buddy and starts looking into her.
Yeah.
Okay, but if he never had any evidence of that with Sandy
Mm-hmm.
and he's just imagining it, you have to assume that he doesn't have trust because he is untrustworthy.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying. And a big thing with this case, too, or it's, something that no one is really sure on, is if Sandy knew that he had looked into her prior to, when she disappeared. Did she know about this? Was she running away from this or something? That was a question mark in the beginning.
Did she notice Clifford? I assume that if he was like best friends with Billy
Mm-hmm.
and she knew that Clifford was this friggin' PI,
Yeah.
and then she caught a glimpse of Clifford tailing her one day, she'd be like, this motherfucker, I don't believe it.
Yeah, it's possible. And then, who knows what kind of alerts you could have on your credit report for something like this, or who knows, I don't know how PIs pull this information without people knowing it, but for all we know, he seemed a little
Not
wishy-washy, so maybe she did find out. We don't really know that. But before we dive into even more of these connections between Clifford and Billy and everything that allegedly transpires after this, I do want to back up and provide you with that background info on Billy before we continue on, as I do believe the context is very important.
Okay, so just because I said I was going to do this, and I want to stay faithful to our listeners, we have Clifford Ailey, who in July of 2005 was charged with 4 counts of essentially obstruction.
Yeah.
Then we find out that Clifford is essentially best friend to Billy. Clifford owns Sloan Detective Agency, and he is a PI.
Mm-hmm.
Then we find out that Clifford not only is a PI, but he's charged with simple assault and harassment against an ex-girlfriend.
Mm-hmm.
So we think he may have a sordid past, whatever. And then we find out that Billy hired or asked Clifford to look into Sandy based on the idea that there may be infidelity going on.
Correct. You are right on track.
Let's keep going.
All right.
Oh, wait.
Mm-hmm.
We found out about Sandy's past.
Yes, we did. Yep.
We know that she was married 6 times and that she's technically still married to some guy in Florida.
Correct. Yes.
All right. Let's go.
All right. So Billy Cree Jr. was allegedly very upset about Sandy's past marriages and the fact that she was still technically married while they're planning their wedding. But like I said before, Billy isn't all that clean, and his marital past isn't that much better, as Sandy was going to be his 3rd wife. And based on my research, it doesn't appear as though his previous marriages were all that hunky-dory. Now, according to reporting done for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, there had been a police report filed by Billy's 2nd wife, Deborah Cree, and that happened back in October of 1997. And in this statement, she stated that Billy had, quote, beaten her and abducted her at gunpoint October 31st, 1997 in Austintown, Ohio, end quote. But the unfortunate thing is that Deborah ended up giving the Austintown police 2 different stories. Maybe even 3. I'm really not entirely sure of that, but she gave these different stories of the events she originally stated transpired. One of which being that Billy had not hurt her and he didn't force her to go anywhere with him, but then she apparently changed her story again and made a second statement in which she told police the first statement she made was a lie. So I don't really know what's true in this instance, but Deborah did later make another statement about this whole situation, which I'll read for you now. Quote, my reason for not telling the truth the first time was pure fear that Billy would come back and kill me, she wrote in a statement to police November 14th, 1997, end quote.
Okay, so hear me out. Maybe Deborah knew about the relationship between Billy and Clifford, and maybe she thought that Clifford would catch wind of her going to the police and putting this statement out about Billy. Then she's like, shit, I'm going to get killed over this friggin' stuff. I need to recant it, and I need to just like beg and plead and do whatever I can to stay in Billy's good graces because Clifford is going to find out and he's going to tell Billy.
Yeah, it's possible. And it's interesting that you bring that up because it seems like Clifford Ailey kind of had himself wrapped up in this situation too.
He's like the muscle.
Yeah.
He's like Billy's muscle because he's like, oh, I have a private eye best friend. He can find anything out about you. Who cares about the police? I'll know everything.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying there. And that makes sense. So basically, just for context, Billy ended up being convicted of a misdemeanor for violating a restraining order because at some point there had been one put in place. I don't exactly know when, but he was convicted of this in August of 98, and the judge ordered he be on probation for 2 years due to this offense. And then Deborah and Billy did end up later divorcing. But to go back to the whole thing with Clifford, apparently he showed up at Deborah's house, like Billy showed up at Deborah's house with Clifford. And I think that was when he violated the restraining order, so he must have brought him with him. But the source material on all of that, like the articles written on it, are a little wishy-washy, and it's tough to decipher, so I don't know exactly what the situation was. But based on what John just said about like him maybe being the muscle there, like kind of makes sense to me in this instance. But yeah, that's what I know about, you know, his past and that whole situation with Clifford and his ex-wife.
I would love to know more about Clifford's background. Like, how did he, at least the age of 48, become this private detective? What was he like in his early years? How long did he know Billy? Were they childhood friends? Was Billy, you know, the older friend to him and kind of had influence over him? And then somehow Clifford ended up in this position, but then Billy used his age and influence over the course of their relationship to try and use him as this muscle like I had referred to earlier. And maybe by like their old relationship, they became this, you know, team essentially, and anything that Billy wanted to know, he went to Cliff for, and that's how Cliff stayed friends with Billy because he was able to provide him with information. But, I mean, I have no reason to doubt Deborah and her claims of potential violence in the relationship with her and Billy. And we know that, obviously, later on, Billy's fiance goes missing, and we know that Cliff was charged with simple assault and harassment to an ex-girlfriend, so let's just say that we have a general idea that these two guys may not have the best relationship with women. So I have no reason to doubt Deborah's claims.
Absolutely, me either. I completely agree. So pretty much with everything that I've told you now, you know, we've made it to that 1999 time frame, you know, after Billy and Deborah ended up divorced. Now in 1999, Billy and Sandy meet, and that's pretty much where we've gotten to essentially the beginning of our story, where it first began at the top of the episode. So
yeah, I see how this can be ping-ponged around a lot, but I don't really know how you would be able to tell this story without having this long exposition of giving everybody's background ahead of time.
Yeah, there's no way to like tell you what they do and then go back and be like, oh, but this is what they did, you know, in their past. That you have to like set the stage of why maybe these people did what they did.
Right. If this were like a book, you would have to have a glossary of characters with each character having all their information
100%.
Under it, and then dive into this story from the 2000 time point.
For sure. But then the other thing we have to think about here too is like, I can't give you too much because then it essentially almost like ruins the genuineness of your thought process as we work through this, because then you know too much before we've gotten there. So
I think that's totally fair, and I'm still totally on pace with what you're saying. Yep. And I think our listeners are too, because I'm sure they're smarter than me.
Excellent. All right, so moving right along now, let's dive into the connection between Clifford, Billy, and this investigation, because of course they all coincide and there are a lot of details to work through here. I think this is the part, John, where I found it to be very convoluted, and this is when I said, I need to create a timeline because I'm freaking lost.
My thinking cap is on and I'm ready to pay attention.
Excellent. So back again now to June of 2000, which was within weeks of when Sandy initially went missing. Somehow, some way, Clifford Ailey made his way onto police's radar. I don't know exactly how or why, as I have heard a bunch of different scenarios, but since Clifford was Billy's best friend or one of his very close friends, I think authorities would have likely uncovered that relationship pretty early on, and they probably would have talked to him anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, generally, when you're a private eye or a private detective and you're going into a police jurisdiction, at least nowadays, it is commonplace for you to stop into that PD, call them, or email them, or fax them and say, hey, I'm Clifford Ailey. Here are my credentials. I am going to be conducting an investigation within your jurisdiction. If you get calls on my registration, which is blah, 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 just know that I'm here working in a professional capacity.
Seems perfectly fair to do and necessary and smart.
It should be, because if you're conducting an investigation as a private eye and then somebody calls in a suspicious vehicle and the police go out and they talk to this person, now police are bringing attention to this person who's trying to stay incognito and ruining the entire investigation. So I would assume that the police department already knew who Clifford Ailey was.
Probably,
just from his private detective work. And then maybe they made the connection to Billy during the same time or after the fact, or maybe it was a close-knit community and some of the cops went to school with Billy and Cliff and they knew him since they were kids and they knew that there was a relationship there.
Yeah.
Who knows?
That would make sense. Regardless, though, of how Clifford wound up on police's radar in the first place, I think what really matters is that they found out about him and they began asking him questions.
They must have known that he had a connection to Billy.
Absolutely.
For some type of friendship, at least.
They had to have known that. So investigators brought Mr. Ailey in to question him and asked him about Sandy and her disappearance to see what he might have known at that point. Again, remember, we're still in June of 2000.
Side note.
Yeah.
If I'm Billy and my best friend is a PI and my wife goes missing, who am I going to contact after I contact the police? The friggin' PI.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when the police are now talking to Cliff and they probably know of some type of relationship that he has with Billy, regardless of how in-depth they're aware of that relationship, they're probably like, oh, you're friends with Billy? Oh, his wife went missing? Did he talk to you about it? Where is she at? Have you been looking into this?
Yep.
Because it only makes sense that you would contact him.
100%. So this initial interview with Clifford supposedly took place sometime between late June and late July of 2000. There's a little bit of confusion on the exact date in the source material I've been able to find, but regardless, it's right around that time. So Mr. Ailey told authorities in this initial interview that he did not know Sandy personally, that he had never met or even spoken with her before, and that he had never looked into her background prior to when she went missing.
Liar!
Yes, which based on what I've already told you, it's clearly not true. But obviously at the time of this conversation with investigators in 2000, they wouldn't have known that yet.
Or probably wouldn't have known that unless there was some type of, police officer that was on the department that knew that Cliff and Billy knew each other.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, it appears to me that Clifford was also asked about the last time he'd both seen and spoken to Billy during this initial interview with police. It's reported that Clifford's response to these questions was that he hadn't seen Billy for months, with the last time being close to the beginning part of that year, so 2000. And when it came to the last time Clifford said he'd talked to Billy, he told investigators that he'd talked to him about a month to a month and a half prior to this interview he was having at that time. So that would have probably made the conversation he's claiming he had with Billy most recently sometime in April or May. Ailey also provided further details about what the two supposedly discussed, meaning him and Billy, and he said their conversation had to do with some electrical work. And with Billy being an electrician, I guess that made sense. Now, between that time frame in June or July of 2000 through until 2004, I really don't know exactly what authorities were doing, what they'd gathered, or how many times they spoke to Cliff Ailey. We do know they'd gotten at least that witness statement about seeing Sandy's car driving south on the afternoon of May 25th, but otherwise, I just really don't know what they uncovered. But it appears pretty clear, at least to me, that they had their eyes on Billy, and Clifford kind of seemed to be in, I would say, their peripherals, with him being a part of this investigation too.
Or at least that he's lying.
Correct.
Because just to paint a picture, for maybe some of our younger listeners, or maybe something that's not in your mind, we're talking 2000.
Yep.
Literally, in December of 1999, People thought the world was going to end because computers couldn't go to 2000.
It's so true.
Okay? So Clifford probably had no idea what technology would do or what technology was available for police to implicate him in some type of connection with Billy.
Yep.
Billy was probably none the wiser either. I mean, he did electrical work, but doesn't mean he did tech work.
Yep.
So this is right on the cusp of the technological revolution where we start getting the internet and social media and YouTube and all this stuff.
It's Y2K.
People still think that they can lie to the police and get away with it because there's no way that they'll ever find out.
It's absolutely true. 100%.
Right. If you are good friends, if you're Cliff and you're good friends with Billy. Yeah, I saw Billy last week. We're at the bar having beers together.
Yep. But, like, why would you be like, oh, no, I haven't talked to my best friend in months. I haven't talked to my best friend.
That's what I'm saying.
I haven't seen my best friend in months. Like, come on.
No, you say, yeah, I just had beers with him at the bar last week. He was all concerned because he hadn't seen his wife, or his wife made mention that she was in trouble and he hasn't heard from her. And I told him, I was like, hey, you should be calling the police because what if something happens to her?
I completely agree. All right, so now we're going to talk about this roughly 2004 timeframe. So around then, it appears as though investigators got more information out of Ailey, and this investigation would soon hinge on him and the things that he said. Also, just to note, around this same time, it appears as though the Pennsylvania State Police became involved in Sandy's case, but there had been numerous other agencies with involvement over the years, including the Mercer County authorities, Ambridge PD, and the Beaver County Sheriff's Office, all due to where Sandy went missing from. Then you've got the connections to Clifford, where he worked, where he lived. But I assume by this point, it seemed like, anyway, that the Pennsylvania State Police had likely taken the lead. I'm not 100% sure, but figured I would bring it up now.
I mean, I would be pissed off if I was part of one of those lower agencies, not lower in stature, but, you know, not
lesser in jurisdiction.
Right, not overarching state police.
Correct.
Right? If I did all this work and I was this detective that tracked down all this information and then state PD comes in and says, thanks for all your work, but I'm going to take control of this now.
You know what?
I'd be like, fuck you.
You know what state police officer or what state police this made me think of
What?
is... And I'm going to bring up a TV show.
What?
It's always John. It's always John with his movies, but I'm going to bring up a TV show, The Sinner.
I totally know the woman you're talking about.
Yes.
The Sinner Season 1.
Yes, The Sinner Season 1. If I recommend any show to anyone, it's going to be one of two shows, The Sinner or Station 11. If you want to have a good cry, watch Station 11. If you want to have your mind blown, watch The Sinner Season 1.
And Season 4, right?
Season 4 was very good, too, in my personal opinion.
I haven't seen either. I'm working my way towards the end of Season 1.
The end. We're on, like, episode 3.
I'm working my way through Season 1.
Yeah, but there's a state police officer that comes in and, like, kind of takes over the investigation
And
with
shits on everybody.
Cora Tenetti. And she is the epitome of, like, what I think, like, these smaller PDs probably see the state police as. But all right, let's get back to the story. So... at some point in 2004, Clifford Ailey cracked, and he began to completely change the story he originally told authorities. And from what I've gathered, the reason he finally cracked had to do with pressure from investigators over the past several years. That makes sense.
Right. I mean, you put enough pressure on something, eventually it's going to break. And if this is not, you know, blood relationship or a super close relationship where, you know, Clifford owes his life to Billy, eventually you put enough pressure on this guy, he's going to be like, it ain't worth me ruining my life for this guy and to cover up this guy's involvement in something.
Yeah, so we know that Clifford had previously told authorities that he didn't know anything about Sandy. He said he never met her. He said he never investigated her, all that. But we already knew that that was completely false, at least the background check portion, and we knew he was lying about that. And he did actually later tell authorities the truth about this, and he expressed to them that he did look into Sandy's background, and he informed them of what he'd uncovered. But as we continue on, I do have something I want to go over regarding Sandy's car before we dive into more about Clifford, and then I want to discuss more about him, his involvement with things, as well as the original statements made by him, and then I want to compare those to the changes that came later. And I do just want to preface this next part by saying that there were a lot of details on each of these pieces to the puzzle that later came out at trial, because, spoiler alert, Clifford does end up going to trial for these charges he was facing. But I'm going to give you the majority of like everything that I know about each of these aspects of the cases we continue on, because you deserve the full picture as we're talking about it. But I just want you to know that a lot of this does come out later during trial.
Okay, so just to touch on the fact that we're going to bounce back to Sandy and her car.
Yes.
I mean, sure, it's a Honda Accord, which is a very common vehicle, especially in this time frame. It's an older car, whatever. But you have a vanity plate that says Sandy on the front of the freaking car.
Yes, and Florida plates in Pennsylvania.
It's got to stand out.
Yeah.
So what do we learn about the car?
All right, so this is probably the most frustrating piece to this case. When I first read it, my mind was like blown. And then when I found more details about it, I was like, how is this real? How did this actually happen in real life? And I do just want to say, too, this does coincide with what I've mentioned regarding Clifford and his changing stories and everything. This all, like, everything weaves together. So just
and we'll
keep
all piece
that
it
in
together.
mind.
Once you give us this information, we will piece everything
You
together.
will. I think you will. So, as we know, Sandy was last seen in the surveillance footage at the convenience store, leaving the parking lot in her own car, and nothing seemed off. Well, after that, authorities never put out a bolo for her 1988 blue Honda Accord, and it wasn't located until years after her disappearance. Authorities have even said that they feel awful about dropping the ball on that aspect of this case because it could have been full of evidence if they'd located it all those years prior, and they fully admitted that. But here's the story on when the car was found and what happened to it after Sandy went missing. So 3 or 4 years after Sandy disappeared, her car was located, but it was unfortunately in a salvage or scrap yard and had been crushed. And like I just mentioned, any evidence that might have been found in it was long gone by this point.
I sure hope the salvage yard kept records of who dropped the car off.
No, here's the wild thing. Her car had been located right after she went missing, within a day or two, actually. And it was located at the Shenango Valley Mall in Hermitage, Pennsylvania, which was only about 7.5 miles or a 10 to 15 minute drive south of where Sandy was last seen on May 25th, 2000.
I'm confused. It was found in a salvage yard.
4 years later.
4 years later.
Correct.
But the vehicle had been located at a mall.
Yes.
So was the vehicle towed by police?
No.
Who was the vehicle towed by?
Well, her car had been located at the mall and subsequently repossessed. Because remember, she'd been behind on her car payments.
I know, but we're talking 12 years. Like, she must have bought a used car, financed the used car,
Correct.
and was behind on the payments. Because when I think an 88 car, I'm like, oh, I would never think to say she was behind on payments on that because we're talking 12 years later. But she had probably bought a used car. I didn't even make that connection.
Yeah, so somehow, some way, the finance company found out that the car was at the mall, they located it, they picked it up, and they sold it at auction. Which is just absolutely unbelievable, but I did just want to make mention, like as I was, reviewing this and researching this, I would have to think that whatever evidence could have been in the car would not have been easily seen by the naked eye, because I highly doubt if this car were, say, for example, covered in blood, that like these repo guys wouldn't have alerted authorities to what they'd found.
I totally agree with that. And the only thing I want to try and hammer home in this particular instance is most things that end up falling between the cracks do so because of lack of communication. Now, had Sandy been reported missing early on, then perhaps this repossession company would have known that the registered owner of this vehicle was reported missing.
Yes.
Because generally when a company is going to repossess a vehicle, again, just similar to the private detective, they will contact the local police department and they will say, hey, I'm going here for a repo. If anybody calls and says that I'm stealing their car, I'm not. It's being repossessed. Just to avoid any type of confrontation with police and whatever. So, I mean, had she been reported missing earlier, maybe the tow company would have known that.
Yeah.
And this could have started the investigation and the ball rolling way faster.
You're 100% right. And the investigators felt the same way. They were beyond frustrated by their lack of a bolo and their ability to locate the car early on. And one of the original detectives, Trooper Robert Lewis, who is now retired, admitted that he made a big mistake when he wasn't able to find her car, and he even stated, quote, "It got right by me. I admit it, I had no idea where her car was," end quote.
I wonder, did he get sent, or did he look through the location where the vehicle was found and he just overlooked it? Is that what he means?
It was several towns away. It was south of where she was last seen. It wasn't...
So probably not.
Yeah, I would think not.
But I mean, anytime that you're involved in an investigation and you miss something, you're going to feel bad regardless of how somebody or even yourself may feel you should have found it.
Yeah.
Especially when you find out that there is a bad outcome, if that is where we're going with this.
Well, I don't know if you're starting to realize this yet, but I'm telling you this story as we're discussing Clifford Ailey. And it wasn't just investigators' fault that the car was never located, because there was someone behind the scenes hindering their investigation. So, if you haven't already guessed, yes, Clifford Ailey is who threw a wrench in this whole situation with the car. Ailey told authorities that he was the person responsible for alerting the finance company that the car was at the Shenango Valley Mall.
What a dick.
He said he called the finance company to tell them they could locate the car there, as he knew it would get repossessed due to her failure to make payments on it. All right, so now that we've covered the whole bit about the car, I want to go back to Clifford's stories and, all of his changes to the original statements he made to police. So the first thing has to do with a previous question that authorities had asked Ailey. We talked about this before when we first started discussing him, and that was regarding how long it had been since he'd last spoken or last seen Billy. He'd previously told investigators that he had not talked to Billy for several weeks and he hadn't seen him for several months prior to when Sandy went missing. But as authorities investigated him further, it was discovered that he actually had been in, quote, regular contact with Billy both before and after Sandy vanished.
Am I right in thinking that Sandy's dead and in the trunk and the vehicle is brought to this location and then the repo company gets a tip that the car's there, so it gets repossessed and then eventually sold?
No.
Okay, continue.
I'm going to give you the big whammy now.
The big whammy.
Yeah. Clifford Ailey told authorities that Billy Cree Jr. confessed to him that he'd killed Sandy Baker. And this admission from Clifford supposedly came in June of 2004, and he apparently decided to spill the beans on this information he allegedly knew in order to try and get a lesser sentence or avoid jail time for hindering this investigation. So, let's back up a bit so you can get the full story of how this whole alleged confession went down. So, back on May 28th, 2000, just 3 days, is that accurate math now? Yes, it is. So that was 3 days after Sandy went missing and after Clifford had already called the finance company and her car had gotten repossessed. So now he and Billy supposedly met up. And for some reason, during this conversation, Billy allegedly confessed to Clifford that he'd actually killed Sandy. And here's what Clifford had to say about, how this whole conversation with Billy went down.
What?
Yeah, I know. So he stated that the two had an argument, meaning Sandy and Billy, presumably over the whole infidelity thing that Billy thought was going on, that he then strangled her and hid her body in Mercer County, anywhere from 5 to 8 miles from his parents' home, the one he'd shared with Sandy. And it was also stated that Billy had allegedly told Clifford that he put Sandy's body in a container somewhere where no one would trip over it.
I feel like Cliff is making the story up.
Really?
Because if he's being charged with 4 counts of hindering the investigation, you have to assume that each instance is something different. So
yes.
If he hid somebody, if he gave a statement that was false, if he gave a separate statement that was false, all of those would be separate instances and separate charges.
Yeah, so further details on this alleged confession came out during trial. And I guess it was more so in regards to, I would say, Billy's demeanor when Cliff said the two of them spoke. And I guess some other statements that were allegedly made by Billy to Clifford. And this is all according to Clifford, in his testimony, all that. Because like I said before, a bunch of this stuff comes out at trial.
Well, if Clifford isn't truthful one time, can you really believe that he's truthful any other times?
Hey, I don't know. So Clifford Ailey testified that Billy seemed out of sorts, not like himself, and nervous when he met with him on May 28th of 2000. And he also mentioned that Billy was still upset about what Clifford had found out in this background check, especially the fact that Sandy had still technically been married. Ailey also claimed he had no clue that Sandy was missing until Cree told him and showed him a newspaper article about the story, which didn't really make all that much sense to me because I couldn't find any newspaper articles from May, but who knows if there was like something in a local paper that I just don't have access to. Who knows? But either way, NBC News Online reported what Clifford testified had happened at the end of his and Billy's conversation that day. Quote, "The men paid their bills, and in the lobby, Ailey recounted, crying, he said, 'If you ever tell anybody what I told you here today, I will have your kids killed.'" End quote.
Jeez.
Now, I mentioned before that authorities were made aware of this alleged confession in June of 2004. Then, when Clifford was arrested and had his hearings and all that, authorities then found out about this now alleged threat to Clifford's kids, and they supposedly discovered this information around mid-November of 2005, from what I can tell anyway. So they heard the original story from Clifford that Billy had confessed to him like a year and a half before they're finding out that he supposedly threatened his kids.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Then, after the trial, NBC News Online reported that, quote, Bonner argued if Ailey had told police about the threat and murder confession in 2000, they could have protected his children and may have been able to arrest Cree. Police also could have found Baker's car, which they discovered in a junkyard in early 2004, end quote. So, backing up again to June of 2004, when Clifford told investigators that Billy had supposedly confessed to him. Obviously, this was a missing persons case, most likely presumed homicide, and authorities really had no leads, and this was the best they'd gotten so far. And due to what he'd said and the fact that authorities had their eyes on Billy already, they were ready to offer Clifford a deal, assuming he could prove that he had no physical involvement in the murder of Sandy Baker.
Which I think is fair.
Absolutely.
I mean, it turns out, if everything that Cliff is saying is true, that, you know, he lied for his friend, but only under duress, and believing that if he went forward and told anybody, that his children would be hurt.
Exactly. So Clifford claimed he had no involvement other than what he'd already told them about the car and the background check, etc. And I think he even used the term of being peripherally involved. So authorities said, okay, if you're telling the truth, then take a polygraph. If you can show you had no physical involvement, that you're being truthful, then sure, we'll set you free.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, if Clifford could pass the polygraph, he was being given a quote-unquote free pass, is like what they called it.
On the charges.
Correct. And it was also reported that he was being offered a, quote, non-prosecution agreement with the DA's office that his statements in response to investigators' questions would not be used as evidence against him, end quote. It was also further clarified that, quote, Mercer County Common Pleas Court Judge Christopher J. St. John said prior to Ailey's trial that prosecutors could not use a written statement provided by Ailey as evidence at trial, but could use his verbal answers to questions that police derived from the written statement, end quote.
So essentially what I get from that is that they're willing to cut him a deal where whatever he says, if it turns out to be true and factual, that he will not be charged for obstructing their investigation.
Yes.
But if he does give that information and say it were to lead to a conviction of Billy, but if after the fact they were to find out that he was somehow not peripherally, but directly involved in either her murder or getting rid of the body or whatever, anything outside of those obstruction charges, that they could still go forward and charge him with it.
Yes, that's what that seems like to me. I'm no legal expert, but that's kind of what I gathered from it too. So Clifford was given the polygraph, and big shocker here, he failed it.
Oh, come on, Cliff.
I know that polygraphs aren't reliable. We've talked about this a bunch. I get that. But this was being used to barter a deal. It's not like they're trying to use this to prove that he's guilty of anything, right?
Right.
So either way, he failed it. And according to a piece in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, quote, the examiner found that he was untruthful to questions about whether he was involved in Miss Baker's disappearance and whether he knew where her body was, end quote.
Bum, bum, bum.
Yeah.
Sounds like Cliff may be involved in either getting rid of the body or physically involved in the murder.
Yeah.
Or maybe present during the murder, at least.
Yeah. I mean, he's failing the polygraph. He's lying left and right,
He's saying whatever can save his ass.
That's what it seems like.
Where some of it may be true, but he's leaving out anything that may incriminate himself in the murder of Sandy or getting rid of her body or whatever.
Correct, yeah. So, since Mr. Ailey ended up failing the polygraph, he now lost the deal he had in the works with authorities and obviously the DA, and he ends up going to trial. So, Clifford's trial took place in January of 2006 and lasted 2 days. And it began roughly around January 11th, and prior to the trial, Clifford actually had not been able to make bail. So, since July of 2005, when he'd turned himself in, to this point in January of 2006, he'd been held in the Mercer County Jail. So Clifford's jury consisted of 7 men and 5 women, and one of the big things that the judge had to instruct the jury on in this trial was that it was not a trial regarding the murder of Sandy Baker. They were not here to find anyone guilty of her presumed murder. This trial was about Clifford Ailey supposedly having misled this investigation. However, I will say I did see it reported in a Newcastle News Online piece that Clifford could potentially later face murder charges in this case. But spoiler alert, that hasn't happened as of today in January of 2023. But anywho, Clifford Ailey was so drama, and he came to court.
So drama.
And he came to court in a wheelchair.
Gosh.
And he was telling reporters that he was in bad health due to, quote, inhumane conditions in the Mercer County Jail, end quote.
Yeah, sure.
And I actually have a picture. I could not find a picture of Billy Crier, but I bet you I found a picture of Clifford Ailey. So there is a picture in this file I have for you, John, so you can see what he looks like in his wheelchair as he's being wheeled in his orange jumpsuit.
He looks angry.
He looks very angry. Pretty much everything I told you about the lies that Clifford fed to authorities came out. But there's one big thing that I saw reported that, if true, could show that Sandy's murder was not a spur-of-the-moment, crime-of-passion type thing, but that it was potentially pre-planned. Here's what was reported in a Pittsburgh Post-Gazette piece regarding that. Quote, Mr. Ailey told police that Mr. Crier asked him on May 24th, 2000, to dispose of Miss Baker's car. That was the day before she disappeared. Knowing that Miss Baker was behind on her car payments, Mr. Ailey called the finance company. He said he would supply information to help it repossess her vehicle. On May 25th, the very day Miss Baker vanished, he called the company again. Mr. Ailey said her blue 1988 Honda Accord was parked at the Shenango Valley Mall. Repo men hauled away her Honda and any evidence it contained, end quote.
So you have to assume that Billy had been speaking to Clifford at least on the 25th, the last day that Sandy was seen alive. And if she is on surveillance footage alive on the 25th at the Sheetz convenience store, she's still alive there.
Yep.
But things were already set in motion to try and get rid of the vehicle. There's the premeditation. Now, we already have somebody working on the vehicle. How do we get rid of Sandy? So, what do we find out about that?
I mean, it's a big statement, and it's one that I don't believe has ever been proven. But there was one other thing that kind of coincides with that a little bit that was reported from that same Pittsburgh Post-Gazette piece that I found. And I thought it was particularly interesting, and I wanted to tell you about it. And yet again, it goes back to this whole thing with Sandy's car. Quote, in his taped statement, Mr. Ailey admitted to owning a blue 1988 Honda Accord that looked like Miss Baker's. He said he bought the car the spring she disappeared. Mr. Bonner's implication to the jury was that the car gave Mr. Ailey a ready explanation if anybody claimed he had been seen driving Miss Baker's Honda, end quote.
Very interesting. So there is a good possibility that after Sandy was seen at the Sheetz and after she was seen driving south, something happened after that last sighting. Maybe she was killed. And then maybe Clifford was the one that drove the vehicle to this mall area, and that's why he knew where it was, and that's why he could call the repo company and tell them where to pick it up.
Very, very possible. The other thing that I was questioning a little bit, has to do with the fact that, like, she's seen driving south towards Sharon, right? I don't know that much about this sighting. I don't know if they just saw her car. I don't know if they saw the license plate Sandy affixed to it. I don't know if they, physically saw her driving, like, sitting next to them at a red light. I don't know the details of this sighting. So what I question is, first of all, was it her in the car driving south towards Sharon? And two, I guess this isn't really a question, but Sharon is directly to the west of Hermitage, where that mall is. So if you look at a map, I have a link for it, John, if you want to take a look.
Yeah, I'll look right now.
You can see leaving Transfer, Pennsylvania, where she was last seen at the Sheets, driving south, she would hit directly at Hermitage. So for all we know, this witness is saying, oh, she's driving south towards Sharon, but she could have been driving south towards Hermitage too.
Very true. And she could have been he.
That's sketchy that he would buy the same car the month she goes missing. I mean, that's weird.
I mean, you have 12 years of newly manufactured motor vehicles and how many different makes and models.
And you
Why are
pick
you buying that? Sure, it's probably good on gas mileage.
Come on.
But come on.
But also, look at Clifford. He's a big dude. Why is he driving that tiny car? Would he fit?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, maybe he put some extra weight on after the fact. But something that I keyed in on, and I mean, when you see something at a glance, it's very easy to like say, oh yeah, it could have been this or it could have been that. We know that Sandy had a short-haired pixie cut style hairdo.
Yeah.
And in this picture that you have of Clifford Ailey, when he's wearing an orange jumpsuit, he's got long hair for a guy.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I don't know what his hair was like back in 2000, but...
I know, but I'm just saying, if he is a guy that would normally wear his hair a little bit longer, and somebody just catches something out of their peripherals, and they see the car driving with the Sandy license plate or a Florida plate,
Yep.
and they see, just a haircut or whatever, I don't know. Who knows? It's a total chance encounter to see, a man driving this car and thinking it's a woman, but is it possible? I guess possibly.
Well, I mean, we've talked about this before, too. Like, I think we talked about it in Amy Baker's case. Interesting with the last name there. But you were talking about, like, people being able to see things on the side of the highway that they wouldn't have noticed, like a person who was stopped there. But you might notice just the car. You might not be able to pay attention to who the person is.
I saw this vehicle on the highway.
Exactly.
And maybe it was misreported
going
that somebody
70
saw
miles an
Sandy.
hour. Are you going to see that that's her? Or are you just going to see that it's a car? And you're like, oh, that's because I always notice a vanity plate.
Yeah, but I think also, too, like a Florida license plate in a Pennsylvania area stands out, too.
Exactly. License plates that aren't Rhode Island or Mass around here, I'm like, who are you?
Yeah.
Why are you here?
So now we have more incriminating information that Clifford did not give out willingly that comes to light during the investigation.
And trial.
And he's looking worse and worse the more time that passes.
Absolutely. But regardless of all of this, Ailey still claims his innocence in the actual murder of Sandy Baker and states that he'd never even met her and that Billy was the one who killed her. With the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reporting, quote, Mr. Ailey told authorities he was only peripherally involved in Miss Baker's disappearance. He claimed Mr. Crier was the killer and acted alone, end quote. And the biggest thing I think about all of this is that authorities feel as though Clifford running this background check on Sandy essentially provided the motive for her murder, with the DA who prosecuted Ailey in 2006 stating, quote, the Commonwealth suggests Mr. Ailey supplied the motive for Mr. Crier for the murder of Miss Baker, end quote.
I gotta say, I'm gonna play devil's advocate and I'm gonna put Cliff in maybe a better light than where that statement maybe puts him. But if you're hired as a private investigator to gather information on somebody, you cannot willingly give that information to somebody, that you were hired to get and then think it's fair to be charged for providing the information that you were hired to gather.
No, I get that 100%.
Right.
But I think they're saying like this essentially started this chain of events and
right. But
him,
I don't think, and I get that, but I don't think that Clifford should be prosecuted or held accountable for providing that information.
I don't think so either, especially if he was doing it lawfully,
right,
as he was supposed to. He was doing the things that he was allowed to do under his PI license.
Which he was still licensed to do at the time.
Which he was, exactly. But I think what the state is trying to prove is, do we have enough here to say that there's a motive? How did this motive become a motive? And it essentially does, unfortunately, stem back to Clifford pulling this information, but it isn't essentially his fault that there was a motive there. Like, Billy, regardless, felt as though Sandy was potentially cheating on him or whatever it is that was going on in his mind. And I think maybe this was just fuel to the fire.
Right. That would be like if you were to hold Clifford accountable for gathering that information and providing it to Billy, that would be like some vigilante gaining information about, say, a pedophile through a news outlet. And because he had it out for pedophiles, he went and murdered that person.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying there.
Right. You can't hold the news agency accountable for putting out that information or to gathering that information.
Yeah, I almost think this was a way for, like, the state to say, like, this is why we think Billy is involved. This is why we're naming him as a suspect. Here's the background on that.
Right. I think that they're building their case because they're saying Billy hired or asked his friend to look into his wife because he thought that something bad was going on. And once that his suspicions were confirmed, that sent him over the edge.
But I don't even think his suspicions were confirmed either. Like, I get what you're saying, but from all accounts, it does not appear as though she was cheating on him.
No, she may have lied or
omitted the truth.
Yes.
But everybody's got a history, so maybe Sandy just hadn't gotten around to telling him yet. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a good or bad thing. I'm not saying, like, it's has no bearing on me. That's her decision.
Right.
And if she didn't want to tell him, she didn't want to tell him. If she was planning to tell him, great.
Yes, I think that Billy being suspicious, getting a PI to look into it, and then, even if it's not confirming his suspicions, but providing him with information that may see his new fiance in a negative light.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden she goes missing. I think you're building on motive there. But I don't think Clifford should at all be held accountable for doing his job and gathering that information. But I understand how they're building that motive with Billy through Clifford.
I agree. Yeah. And I just wonder too, if Billy's all pissed off about this, did he tell her about what happened with his exes?
Right.
Like,
Probably
did he
not.
tell her that he violated a restraining order at the very least?
Right. It's called projection.
I agree.
He's got a shady past. He can't believe this new woman, so he hires his PI to look into it, and then he probably gets pissed off when he finds what's uncovered.
Yeah. So, with all that being said, we are still discussing the trial of Clifford Ailey and his potential for hindering this investigation. This is not a murder trial for the presumed killing of Sandy Baker. So, back to Clifford's trial. That wrapped up within 2 days, and I believe by either January 12th or the 13th of 2006, the jury went out to deliberate. And it only took them 90 minutes to come up with their guilty verdicts. But Clifford did actually get off on one of the 4 charges. So he was found guilty of lying about doing the background check, about lying to authorities regarding his last conversations and last times he'd seen Billy, and lying about if he'd known what kind of car Sandy had. The one charge he was found not guilty of had to do with if he'd lied about being in Mercer County the day Sandy disappeared, which I think kind of goes back to the comment about the car that we were talking about, you know, the witness that had seen it. And it seems like based on what was presented at trial, the jury couldn't definitively say whether he'd lied about that or not. Therefore, he was found not guilty on that count. I'm not 100% sure if that's exactly what it's about, but that's like what I'm inferring based on what I know.
Yeah, I mean, based on what we know, it would be hard to prove that he was in that location at the time. But, I mean, it's pretty clear to say, oh, he really did know Billy. Oh, he did see Billy on such and such a day, and he knew what type of car Sandy drove. He frigging completed a background investigation on her. Exactly.
So those were very clear cut. And I think that's why the jury was like, okay, this makes sense. How could you find him anything other than guilty? Like, the evidence proves everything for itself without even really going to a trial. Like, if you just looked at a couple pieces of paper and if you see that evidence in front of you, you know. Now, Clifford would be sentenced 2 months later, so on March 3rd, 2006, and he was sentenced to 18 to 48 months in prison, which wasn't all that bad considering each count carried a maximum sentence of 7 years. But if he had been lucky, the minimum was just 3 months probation. And he did actually try and attempt to appeal that conviction in 2006, but that was denied. But as 2006 continued on, more information about Clifford Ailey came out in the press. And that had to do with his actions while incarcerated in the Mercer County Jail as well as during trial. And due to those actions, he actually ended up getting sentenced to additional time. It's reported that he threatened lawyers, judges, and guards from, I think, November of 2005 through until when his trial began. So according to reporting done for the Sharon Herald, Ailey, quote, told one prison guard he would have a reckoning with him and threaten the man's girlfriend, police said. Another time, police say Ailey told an official he would take his weapon, try to escape, shoot everyone in the courtroom, and blow up the building. Ailey claimed he had friends on the outside who would help him, and he told a deputy he would castrate him, police said.
My friend Billy's going to come to my rescue.
No, because Ailey claimed, later anyway, that the reason he's threatening all these people was because he was pissed off that he's stuck in jail, yet Billy, whom Clifford was alleging killed Sandy, was free as a bird. And he's also, pissed off that Billy had threatened to hurt his family, and that's why he's now threatening all these other people.
Yes, the best course of action is committing more crimes to add more time to your sentence when you're pissed off that you're essentially in jail when a murderer that allegedly killed somebody is out on the loose. That is the epitome of stupid.
Yeah, so I think you and the judge felt the exact same way. He totally saw through Clifford and told him, quote, what you did was illogical. You say Cree threatened your children, so then you threatened other people, end quote.
Right. Officials. Like you threatened guards or police officers or judges.
Yeah.
There is literally a charge, threats to public officials.
Mm-hmm. So after that, Clifford wound up getting an additional 12 months added onto his sentence.
So instead of 18 to 48, we're now talking 30 to 60.
Correct. But the interest in Mr. Ailey did not stop there, as he actually wound up on federal authorities' radar a few years later. So fast forward now to 2009, and Clifford ended up charged again, this time for federal weapons charges, specifically 2 federal charges of possessing unregistered firearms. He, quote, admitted having a short-barrel Army San Marco 20-gauge shotgun and an SWD 12-gauge street sweeper, a semi-automatic shotgun with a rotating magazine, between September 8th, 2005 and February 22nd, 2006 at a Washington County storage unit, end quote.
When did he admit to this?
Well, what's wild about this whole situation is that Ailey allegedly tried to get someone, I think it was a family member, to move these guns for him before authorities could locate them in this storage unit that he had. But from how I understand it, he was having this conversation with whoever this family member was while in prison. So his phone calls were recorded.
What a dummy.
It's absurd. I cannot. But from what I've been able to find, it looks like he did plead guilty and was sentenced to an additional 39 months in prison on top of the 5 years he'd already gotten. However, it does appear as though he got out of prison early on in 2013.
So released in 13. Okay.
Yep. All right, so we're going to back up again. Sorry. I know. We're all over the place, but
at least we know now where Clifford has been for the last decade, essentially.
Yes, there's no way that I could just stop in the middle of all that and hold on, let's stop. We need to talk about 2008, Right.
Yeah.
So
understandable. So
I know it's a very jumpy episode. I apologize.
It's okay. So we know that Clifford is a potential player in the murder of Sandy Baker.
Correct.
We know that he was sentenced for lying to police.
Mm-hmm.
We can infer that if he had any information that could implicate Billy in the murder of Sandy and remove himself from suspicion, he could have came forward with that, but he didn't.
Correct. So now we're going to back up to 2008. And in 2008, both of Sandy's children petitioned the court to have their mother declared legally deceased as they were trying to figure out her estate. From what I understand, she still did own that home down in Florida when she'd gone missing, and her kids needed to figure out what to do with that, as well as other things that belonged to her. So her 2 kids had apparently gotten things situated in the Florida courts, but because she went missing in Pennsylvania, they had to obtain a death certificate, I think, in that state before they were able to then transfer the home into their names and kind of figure out what to do with everything. So they went in front of the judge. They explained how their mother had been missing for 8 years at this point. None of her bank accounts or credit cards or even her social had been used in all those years. And they explained how they were convinced she was deceased and had met with foul play. And it didn't take long for the judge to agree, and he granted the motion and declared Sandy Baker legally deceased. Now, also around this same time, between 2008 and 2009, authorities were still working on the case, and they were focusing on Kriye and Ailey. And they'd even mentioned that the investigation was ongoing, and Ailey was, quote, very much a part of that investigation, end quote. But from what I've gathered, I don't think it seems like, anyway, that Ailey was cooperating. I think it was more so that authorities were like, oh, he's a part of this because we know he hindered the investigation and he has this conviction and like he's still potentially a part in this, but I don't know exactly what they thought his full involvement was. And he has never been stated to be a suspect. Billy is the only one that they've ever put out publicly as a suspect. So that's kind of what was going on then. But authorities did mention at that time that they were struggling and really hadn't gotten any new leads in a while, and they were asking the public to come forward with anything that they knew.
And that's in the 2008, 2009 area.
Yes.
While Cliff is in jail.
Correct. Yep. So now fast forward to 2011. An authorities' prime suspect in the presumed murder of Sandy Baker took his own life. Billy Kriye Jr. had apparently been in hospice care and was dying of cancer when around 9:30 p.m. on November 28, 2011, he died by a single self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Now, I had watched this Beaver County Times YouTube video where one of the original journalists who worked on reporting on this case and had previously worked for the Sharon Herald was interviewed. And she said that her first question after hearing that Billy had taken his own life was, did he leave a note? And that was like the very first question that came into my mind, like, are we going to get a deathbed confession in this case? But unfortunately, there was no note and no confession from Billy Kriye Jr.
I understand why they're asking that question.
Mm-hmm.
To me, I'm saying, how the hell did a guy get a gun and a bullet to commit suicide in hospice care?
I don't know if he was in his own home, because you can do hospice in your own home, so maybe that's what it was.
I guess.
But either way, yeah, he did end up taking his own life in 2011, so any answers that he might have known died with him.
So now, really, the person that we would have to lean on to get, hopefully, truthful information is Clifford.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because there was actually something else that was reported the year following Billy's suicide. So this was in 2012. So Billy took his own life in 2011. We know Clifford got out of jail in 2013. So this is the year in between where this is discussed. And this is a piece in the Sharon Herald. And it's kind of in regards to the hope that Clifford knew more, that maybe he knew where Sandy's body was, and the potential that he might be offered immunity if he provided the location of Sandy's remains so her family could give her a proper burial.
Which I think is relatively fair, unless Clifford was the one that killed her.
I agree, and the thing about it, though, is both Sandy's children, as well as her best friend Linda, supported potentially giving Ailey this immunity to be able to learn this information if he, in fact, knew it. And Linda Henry, like we talked about her earlier on, she was really pushing for answers at this point, as she was throughout the whole timeline. But she wanted the current DA at the time, Mercer County DA Robert Cochums, I think is how you say it. She wanted him to get things moving. And it was reported that the DA was, quote, holding things up in regards to this whole potential immunity deal. And Linda and the family seemed particularly frustrated by that, which I can completely agree. Like, they had to know his sentence is coming to an end soon. And Linda stated, quote, Bob Cochums made me feel like he was really going to do something while Ailey was in federal prison. Nothing happened, and still nothing has happened, end quote.
I totally understand the frustration from family and friends. Because if you are willing to forgo penalties being imposed on the potentially responsible party, okay. let them make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know that if there is, a prosecutor or an investigator or whatever that feel as though they are within grasp of pinning this murder on Clifford Ailey, they don't want to give him immunity.
Yeah, I mean, I get that, but why hasn't he ever been stated to be a suspect? They seem to have their eyes.
It could be an ego-related thing.
I guess, but that shouldn't be.
I totally agree.
Ego should not be involved in this type of situation, and it's interesting that you say that too, because there was this one comment, and I think it was honestly the last sentence of the article that I read, and it said that the DA, so this Bob guy, stated that he gave Linda, quote, a lot of credit for caring, end quote.
That's
is that not the rudest thing that you've ever heard? Okay, because when I read that, I was like, wow, that sounds pretty fucking nasty.
It seems like, that person's probably trying to pass it off as a compliment to kind of shoo somebody away and be like, you don't need to be involved in this anymore.
I'm so glad that you cared, but I'll handle this from here. And he's clearly not handling it.
Exactly.
I just thought that was really rude and not very nice. But
yeah,
because Linda's been so steadfast in this.
Yeah, but I mean, if Linda, as well as Sandy's remaining family members, are willing to provide immunity to Clifford Ailey just to find their mother's body,
I think it's fair.
I think it's fair. But I mean, like I had said, the whole ego thing, if they are right on the cusp of being able to find some type of information to implicate Clifford Ailey in the direct murder of this woman, I mean, how good would it look for them to say, oh, this decades-old cold case is now solved, and we have the suspect in custody, and he has been charged with the murder of Sandy Baker.
All well and good, but we're a decade later now, and they got nothing.
Right, I totally agree. And I've often stated my opinion on allowing family members of victims to make decisions in the process of charging people or sentencing people or whatever. But
you just
it doesn't
said,
change things.
Yeah.
It doesn't change how people in power make their decisions.
And especially people with egos.
Yes.
Sucks.
And what's even worse is if Clifford Ailey did not have direct involvement in Sandy Baker's murder, but knows where her body is, that's even worse to not give him immunity on, because it's information that he has, but he may be withholding that because if he gives the information of where the body is located, then the prosecution may come forward and say the only way that he knows where this body is because he was involved and he did it.
Yep. And that was one of the questions on the polygraph that he supposedly lied on was, did he know where her body was?
Right, but now he's out of federal prison and we're talking a decade later. Whereas if a decade previous...
And he's still alive. He is still alive today based on my research.
Give him immunity and say, hey, if you know this information and you give it to us, you are totally immune to prosecution as far as the murder investigation of Sandy Baker, because the family members want to know where she is so they can lay her to rest.
Absolutely. So Linda Henry had actually written to Ailey while he was in prison, and she even offered him the $6,000 reward for the information that he might have known, but he just never responded to her letters. And I think that goes back to what John was just saying about could he potentially be implicated.
Right.
But I do want to talk about Linda and what she had done for her best friend over all these years. She has been an absolute rock when it comes to fighting for attention for her best friend and trying to keep her name in the public eye. Each year, she would push to get the media to cover her case. She held yearly vigils and memorials. She constantly kept in touch with police to help keep Sandy in the forefront of their minds. John brought it up earlier about the milk cartons. She did that. I mean, she has just done so much. And at one point, Linda was asked why she puts this on every year. And she stated, quote, "I do it because I love Sandy and because no one should ever be murdered and the family not know what happened to them. That's not right. That's not fair," end quote. And I just have to tell you, she reminded me so much of Jerry.
I knew you were going to say Jerry.
Yes, Teresa Corley's sister. So John had brought this up earlier, if he felt as though maybe Linda thought Billy was good for it or something like that. And you could tell that she didn't trust this guy. And she even confronted him in public anytime she saw him, trying to get him to come clean.
That lady's got balls.
Yes, and that's what I said about Jerry too. Like, to be able to confront the person that you think is involved in your loved one's murder.
And somebody that's capable of murder.
Yes. I don't have those kind of balls.
You got to have a lot of courage to do that.
So,
a lot of courage and conviction in wanting to know what happened to your loved one.
Absolutely. As of today, though, after that piece in 2012 regarding potential immunity in the hopes that they'd find Sandy's remains, that's the last I've seen reported on her case. And from what I understand, like I just said, I'm pretty sure Clifford Ailey is still alive, and he may be the only person who knows what happened to Sandy almost 23 years ago now. I don't know what could possibly compel him to tell what he might know if he had the potential of immunity offered, but just to make it clear, we do not know if the DA ever brought this up to him, if that's been an option, if it's still on the table. I would hope it would be. And I do just want to make mention, too, at this point that we had talked earlier about where Sandy's body could have potentially been hidden, how Billy allegedly said to Clifford that it was 5 to 8 miles from his parents' home, that it was in Mercer County, that she was placed in some sort of container. And authorities did say that they searched the area where Clifford had claimed Billy told him where her body was. I haven't seen anything reported on any sort of thing that could even indicate that there might have been a body there. And I think that original search was done like back in the mid to early 2000s. And I don't know what they found. I don't know if they found anything, but I don't think it would hurt to search again. That's very specific. And it's not that big of an area, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. If there is any truth to that, I think you have a rural area. Maybe there's not, municipal water or municipal sewer. Could there be wells that are no longer in use? Could there be cesspools or septic tanks that a body could have been weighed down in?
I mean, that's considered, in my mind, a container. That's
I would assume
possible.
so as well, yeah. So I would hope that that lead was worked beforehand, but there's a good chance that maybe some type of container was overlooked. And I think really the only way that you're ever going to know the truth while Clifford Ailey is still alive is to provide him immunity to locate Sandy Baker's body. And I think if the family and friends are pushing for that, everybody that's involved in the investigation should put aside their ego, if that's even a factor, and provide that immunity. That way the family gets what they want.
I completely agree. Now, as we wrap up this episode today, I really think there's only one or two theories, and John and I have kind of gone through them throughout this entire episode. I think you've got Billy Creay potentially having involvement here, Clifford Ailey potentially having involvement, or both of them potentially having involvement.
Yes, and if push came to shove, I would say that there is some truth to Clifford Ailey having been peripherally involved, but maybe more so than he would like to admit.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a possibility that he could have witnessed Billy Creay murdering Sandy, or saw her dead body being moved from a vehicle and was employed to get rid of the vehicle.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely possible.
And he knew that she had been murdered.
I mean, it tracks, but...
I mean, you have a best friend asking you to help out. You're a private detective. You're a private eye.
Yeah, this isn't an Adnan Syed and Jay who barely know each other that people try and say they're, asking him to help get rid of a body. These are people with a very clear long-term relationship.
Right, and you have an intimate knowledge of how investigations go.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's a very good chance that Clifford Ailey is more involved than he wants to admit, and Billy was probably the responsible party in the murder of Sandy Baker. But this can all very quickly be wrapped up with immunity for Clifford Ailey in identifying where and how Sandy Baker was murdered.
I completely agree. And I would think that if, say, Billy supposedly told Ailey about this all those years ago, if that is the truth, that he could have told someone else. So if there's anyone out there with further information that could help solve this case, please don't continue to keep it to yourself. Sandy's loved ones deserve to know where she is. She deserves to be found and properly laid to rest. And I think something that Linda Henry said is particularly poignant and holds true not only in this case, but many cases we've covered. Quote, "Fear keeps them from coming forward. Realize, even if you're afraid, that to think of the fact if you had a loved one missing, wouldn't you want someone to come forward and help you?" If you know anything about what happened to Sandy Baker or know where her remains are, please contact the Pennsylvania State Police at 724-662-4200 or 724-662-6162. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.